The Yamasee War, which raged from 1715 to 1717, stands as one of the most significant and harrowing conflicts of early colonial America. This brutal war brought the fledgling English colony of South Carolina, barely established and inherently fragile, to the brink of annihilation. The war's origins lay in long-simmering tensions. Decades of exploitation, mismanagement, and relentless economic greed had eroded trust between the colonists and the Native American tribes. By the time hostilities erupted in May 1715, the fragile peace was shattered. Charlestown, now known as Charleston, the colony's capital, became a desperate haven as waves of violence swept across the countryside. Refugees fleeing the chaos poured into the city, which soon found itself besieged. Yamasee warriors, joined by allies such as the Lower Creek, unleashed a coordinated campaign of destruction, torching plantations, plundering livestock, and killing settlers who failed to reach the relative safety of Charlestown. Bands of warriors surrounded the city on all sides, save for the sea, cutting off vital supplies and trapping its terrified inhabitants. The situation inside the city quickly deteriorated. Minister Francis Le Jow offered a haunting account. The Indians that surround us on every side, but the sea revolted from us by unanimous consent. What had once been sporadic skirmishes had now transformed into a large-scale uprising, unified in its goal to expel the colonists. Overcrowding in Charlestown, fueled by the influx of refugees, created conditions ripe for disease, and food supplies dwindled to alarming levels. Cries of fear and despair echoed through the streets, and Governor Charles Craven himself confessed the dire state of the colony, admitting that the settlers were almost naked and defenseless. He lamented their vulnerability, stating, "We know not how soon some of us may be in the hands of those monsters of mankind, the Indians." Reverend Thomas Hassell, meanwhile, took a theological perspective, interpreting the calamity as divine punishment. Quoting Leviticus, he warned, "When ye are gathered together within your cities, I will send the pestilence among you, and ye shall be delivered into the hand of the enemy." This disaster, however, was not inevitable. South Carolina had, for much of its early history, managed relatively peaceful relations with neighboring Native American tribes. This peace was driven not by goodwill, but by strategic pragmatism. The tribes served as a buffer against European rivals like the Spanish and French, and against more hostile tribes deeper inland. Trade relationships appeared, mutually beneficial on the surface. Colonists exchanged European goods such as firearms, metal tools, and gunpowder for deerskins, livestock, and other resources. Yet lurking beneath this veneer of cooperation was the grim reality of the burgeoning Indian slave trade. South Carolina's early economy, still unstable decades after its founding in 1670, leaned heavily on this trade. Before cash crops like rice and indigo could establish the colony's wealth, colonists relied on deerskins, cattle, and, disturbingly, enslaved Native Americans. The deerskin trade was particularly significant, so much so that buckskins became a form of currency, giving rise to the term bucks, still used today as slang for dollars. While this linguistic legacy is a curious historical footnote, it pales against the horrific human cost of the Indian slave trade, which played a direct role in sparking the Yamasee War. The Lords Proprietors, who governed the colony from England, officially banned the Indian slave trade, recognizing its potential to fuel unrest. However, enforcement was lax to non-existent. The Goose Creek Men, a wealthy colonial elite, exploited this loophole. They incentivized tribes like the Yamasee to raid neighboring groups, capturing and selling their people into slavery. In return, the Yamasee received coveted European goods, creating a cycle of dependency on colonial trade. Initially, the Yamasee prospered under this arrangement. By the early 1700s, they had established 10 towns near Port Royal, South Carolina, with a combined population of approximately 1,300. However, as debts to colonial traders spiraled out of control, this once beneficial relationship began to unravel, planting the seeds of the devastating conflict to come. Colonial traders extended credit to the Yamasee and other tribes, allowing them to purchase European goods with the promise of future repayment. However, overhunting had decimated the deer population, making it increasingly difficult for tribes to fulfill their obligations through deerskin exports. By 1711, the Yamasee alone owed over 100,000 deerskins, more than the colony could export in an entire year. In a desperate bid to recover their losses, traders resorted to harsh measures, including threats to enslave the families of debtors, further exacerbating tensions. For many native leaders, the colony's 1715 census, which recorded 28,000 Native Americans across 141 towns compared to just 7,000 colonists, appeared to be a prelude to widespread enslavement. This realization would ignite a fury that had been simmering for years. In an attempt to defuse the situation, Governor Charles Craven dispatched Indian agent Thomas Nairn and his rival John Wright to negotiate with the Yamasee at Pocataligo. The mission, however, was undermined by their conflicting approaches. Nairn sought peace, assuring the Yamasee that their debts would be resolved diplomatically and their land safeguarded. Wright, on the other hand, insulted the Yamasee and questioned their loyalty, adopting a confrontational tone. This contradictory approach, described by historian William L. Ramsey as a schizophrenic policy, left the Yamasee leaders confused and deeply mistrustful. After a night of deliberation, the Yamasee made their decision. At dawn, with their faces painted in red and black, symbols of war and death, they unleashed a devastating assault, marking the beginning of the Yamasee War. The Pocataligo Massacre, as it came to be known, was a brutal opening salvo. Charles Rogge, a colonial merchant, recounted the chaos. At dawn, their terrible war whoop was heard, resembling devils come out of hell. They fired on everybody without distinction and inflicted torture in the most cruel manner imaginable. Thomas Nairn, one of the first victims, endured days of torture before succumbing to his injuries. Rogge's vivid letter to his employer in London remains one of the most critical primary sources on the early stages of the conflict. It describes not only the massacre, but also the desperate days that followed. One survivor, Captain Burrows, managed to escape the slaughter by swimming across a river despite being shot twice. Once through the neck, the bullet exiting his mouth, and again in the back, where it lodged in his chest without hitting any vital organs. Rogge noted, one of which pierced his neck and came out his mouth, and the other pierced his back and lodged in his chest without touching a vital spot. Burrows, gravely injured, managed to reach Port Royal to warn its inhabitants of the imminent attack. While some doubted his story, the bullet wounds in his body and the distant sounds of gunfire and screams convinced most. The town quickly began to evacuate. Unable to use the roads due to the surrounding Indian forces, settlers fled through dangerous terrain, often seeking refuge near water. In a desperate bid for survival, hundreds crammed onto a smuggler's ship that had been secretly prepared for defense. Rogge estimated that approximately 400 people boarded the vessel, their fear palpable as night fell. As darkness cloaked the shoreline, the danger materialized. The Yamasee, finding the settlements abandoned, descended upon the area, their war cries piercing the night air. On board the ship, the refugees clung to the hope of escaping the violence, their fate hanging by a thread. Throughout the night, the Yamasee unleashed a relentless barrage of gunfire at the smuggler's ship, their piercing war whoops reverberating across the shoreline, a chilling symphony of defiance and triumph. Miraculously, none aboard the vessel were harmed. Yet, the destruction didn't stop there. By morning, the Yamasee turned their fury on livestock, systematically slaughtering horses and cattle, looting valuables, and setting every structure they encountered ablaze. Amid the flames, they performed grotesque dances, their jubilant cries painting an unnerving picture of victory. Charles Rogge, a colonial merchant, later remarked that under different circumstances, the scene might have been described as a macabre spectacle of triumph, if not for the catastrophic toll it exacted on the settlers' lives. When the tide rose the following day, the colonists aboard the ship managed to sail north toward Charlestown. Those unable or unwilling to board took their chances, paddling through the maze of sea islands in canoes, or braving the open ocean. Tragically, the plantations between Pocataligo and Port Royal became the sites of further carnage, with over 100 settlers killed or captured. Amid the chaos, one survivor's ingenuity stood out. A man whose name is lost to history evaded capture by stripping himself naked and hiding in a marsh. He reasoned that his lack of clothing would make him resemble the Yamasee, thereby lowering his chances of detection. Against all odds, his unorthodox strategy worked, proving that desperation can inspire effective, if bizarre, solutions. Not all were as fortunate. Among those captured was Thomas Nairn, the prominent Indian agent. Rogg's account describes the horrifying details of his execution. Nairn's captors bound him with heavy pieces of wood, set them aflame, and left him to endure agonizing torment for days before he succumbed. This gruesome method of torture, reportedly used on numerous victims, sent shockwaves of terror through the settler population, fueling an exodus toward Charlestown. Governor Charles Craven, already en route to the area with a militia force of 250 men, was unaware of Nairn's plight. Before his death, Nairn had revealed Craven's movements under duress, and Yamasee scouts quickly tracked the militia. On April 19th, the Yamasee ambushed Craven's forces. Though outnumbered, the colonists' disciplined tactics enabled them to repel the attackers, suffering 20 casualties but killing several key Yamasee leaders and forcing a retreat. Among the belongings of a fallen Yamasee warrior, Craven's men discovered a letter dictated by the Huspa King, a prominent Yamasee leader, and penned by a white captive. The letter articulated the Yamasee's grievances, citing colonial threats of enslavement and executions as the catalyst for war. It also chillingly declared their intent to seize the colony, predicting the fall of its forts and settlements. While revealing their strategy in such detail was tactically unwise, the message, "We are coming for everything," left little doubt about their determination. The Yamasee were not alone in their uprising. Other tribes, including the Lower Creek, Cherokee, and Catawba, harbored their own grievances against the colonists, ranging from mounting debts and dwindling hunting grounds to the pervasive threat of enslavement. In the weeks that followed, violence erupted across the backcountry. Native war parties targeted traders, killing 90 out of 100 in Indian villages. Survivors barely escaped, their fates serving as grim symbols of indigenous resistance to colonial exploitation. By May, Charlestown was inundated with refugees, its resources stretched to the breaking point. Governor Craven's absence left the city vulnerable, though the Yamasee war parties avoided direct confrontation, instead opting to raise plantations and plunder the countryside. Supplies dwindled as food stores, livestock, and crops were systematically destroyed. Aid from neighboring colonies was scarce and often conditional. Virginia, for instance, famously offered help only in exchange for enslaved women. Despite the mounting chaos, the war's tide began to turn. Captain Chicken's militia achieved a critical victory by ambushing a Catawba war party, killing 40 warriors and compelling their withdrawal. This success marked the beginning of the conflict's decline, though sporadic hostilities persisted for years. Some tribes, like the Cherokee, recalculated their alliances, while others, such as the Yamasee, suffered devastating losses. By 1717, the war had effectively ended. The Yamasee, scapegoated as the principal aggressors, were decimated. Over a quarter of their population killed or enslaved. Many survivors fled south to Spanish-held St. Augustine in Florida, seeking refuge. In the aftermath, South Carolina's reliance on the Indian slave trade diminished. But this shift merely redirected the colony's exploitation toward African slavery, laying the foundation for the plantation economy's grim expansion. The Yamasee War, one of colonial America's deadliest conflicts, revealed the precariousness of frontier life and the fragile relationships between settlers and indigenous peoples. It also highlighted the settlers' short-sightedness. Though they survived, their failure to address the root causes of the conflict ensured that the cycle of exploitation and violence would continue. History, it seems, is a teacher whose lessons are too often ignored. Thank you for watching the video until the end. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new videos from us. What do you think about today's topic? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found the video helpful, feel free to share it with your friends and family. We hope you had a great time. See you in the next video with even more exciting content. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out.